Hello, I'm Paula Miller with the Sweetland Digital Rhetoric Collaborative, and as part of our blog Carnival series on gaming and social justice, we're talking today with the coordinators of the Rhetoric, Politics, and Gaming series at The Ohio State University. The RPG series is still fairly young. It was started about a year ago, and what happens is they bring a bunch of people together in one room, they play games, and then they talk about the political and social implications of those games. So it's a chance to look at gaming through a critical engagement lens in a hands-on sort of way. I'm going to introduce the three coordinators here, and then we'll talk a little bit about what they do. So first, we have James Harris, who's a PhD candidate in 20th century U.S. ethnic lit, gender, and sexuality studies. And then we have Tiffany Salter, who is a PhD candidate in contemporary experimental Asian American lit. And we have Andrew Smart, who's a PhD student in American literature, popular culture, and didactic art. Hi guys, it's good to see you.
Hello.
So I'm going to throw this first one out for any of you. Talk to me about the origins of the RPG series. How did this start?
Oh, that sounds like an Andy question.
Sure. About 2 years ago, the English undergraduate organization here in the English department hosted an event around Halloween where someone brought in a horror game. They only had one copy of it, but in spite of that, people really enjoyed taking turns talking about the game and talking about it from the perspective of English studies broadly. So around that time, the leader of that organization, who's now our office manager, brought a few of us together who had an interest in gaming and said, hey, this was really cool. I'm not into gaming, so I don't really know what's going on, but do any of you have ideas of how we could build more events like this, start putting together an audience, and kind of start a greater focus on gaming in the department? So that kind of gave me the opportunity to get in touch with some game developers I was interested in, talk to them about their games, try to get them to give us free or discounted copies so we could play them at a larger scale, because the shortcoming of that first event was having only one copy just kind of leads to a lot of people watching and you lose the interactivity of the game. So yeah, that kind of was the beginning of it all. So we got copies of games like the Stanley Parable and Gone Home, and we contacted the developers to try to get them to both let us have copies at a reasonable rate so we could afford it on our very, very limited budget, and also bring them in to talk to us whenever possible. So that started a series of conversations with game developers, students on campus, kind of focused more towards undergraduate students. And that sort of was the beginning of the RPG series. And then in the next year, James and I started working here in the Digital Media Project, the beautiful room behind us, and it sort of grew into a more formal part of the department.
So it sort of has these organic roots. Now, do you work with just video games, or is it unplugged gaming as well?
Tiffany can speak to that, actually.
So I've actually only coordinated one event. This past March, I coordinated an event built around puzzle games. And so Andy actually had the idea to reach out to a local board game parlor called Kingmakers. And I went down to Kingmakers and talked to them about some of the puzzle games that they had that might kind of fit in with a trial and error sort of theme that we were going with. So we picked out, I can't remember, probably like 4 games, and they brought them. And so we had people playing puzzle games on the computers, video games, and then we had hands-on sort of manipulative puzzles, but also sort of like trial and error mental puzzles. But yeah, definitely unplugged. And it was a really big success. A lot of the attendees really enjoyed it because a lot of our attendees have started coming from other grad departments, and some of them don't have a video gaming background necessarily. A lot of them really enjoyed seeing sort of the ties between video games and unplugged board games.
Mm-hmm. So that's a really interesting opportunity for transition. Who attends these events? You said people are coming from other departments. Who comes?
We have grad students coming from all over, comparative studies, dance,
women's gender and sexuality studies. We've had some engineers. There are a few others, art and technology. So really a pretty decent cross-section of the university has kind of sent us some students. We've had graduate students, we've had undergraduate students, we've had faculty, we've had some staff members. So really we're getting a pretty good selection of people from across the university.
Mm-hmm. So how do you see gaming fitting into your own research?
Well, if I might, I presented a video game symposium my first year in grad school that was here on campus, where there were invited guests from all over, and then two of us from the grad department or the grad program, and then one undergrad. And our little panel was sort of a teaser, you know, for the we'll say established scholars. And I've been interested, and I have interest in pop culture studies as well, kind of as a secondary interest, and video games definitely folds into that. So, I mean, that it's obviously been a long time since I've done that presentation, but I would like to get back to it.
Mm-hmm.
No,
the rest of you, are there connections between gaming and your own areas of research?
So I would say that like my interest in video games sort of happened almost by accident, in part because I was really interested in talking about like technology and consumer technology and the relationships between technology and the state post World War II. And that buildup, which was so much a military buildup, was also then an entertainment buildup. And so the way that like the same technology and technological apparatus that would produce nuclear warfare produced Pong, like that seemed to me like a really fascinating site to explore. And the university then, as the site where that happened, seems like a really generative place to return to. And so like the opportunity to merge all those things back together at a moment where there's a critical buy-in around video games that you can sell people on a conversation they wouldn't otherwise want to have, I think was really enticing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
For me, gaming really became an important part of my identity in the classroom. In my first couple sections teaching composition, I realized that gaming could be a really powerful way to teach rhetoric because students kind of see it as this more carefully designed systemic thing rather than a piece of writing where they just assume that these are just words on a page. It couldn't have happened any other way. So I started teaching with games, and then over time I realized that my project became more and more invested in didactic, persuasive, rhetorical art. And through kind of like the formation of my dissertation, I kind of came to realize that there's this whole body of academic criticism about persuasive games. People like Ian the Ghost write about it a lot. And so I sort of realized that what I wanted to do with literature was very closely aligned with this active conversation about gaming. So I definitely see them converging either within the dissertation or within later work.
How interesting. It's so cool, the fruitful work that people are doing right now with video games. I don't know if you've had a chance to check out some of the most recent blog posts, but we have someone who's doing work with The Sims and gender in the classroom, and someone else who's looking at the Walking Dead video game as a racialized pedagogical site. So they're really worth checking out. Cool stuff. I'm interested in talking for a minute, going back to what actually happens during the series. Can you speak to any really interesting or memorable moments where you saw the intersection between academia and gaming creating a space for a fruitful, lively conversation during one of these events?
I think maybe, James, not to like put this on you,
No.
but the event that you organized, Playdate, I think maybe had some of our most fruitful discussions and kind of brought people together from the most academic disciplines with the widest variety of games. So maybe you could talk about that event as that site of intersection.
Sure. So I think it was our best attended event, which helped in terms of getting, because I think these events work best when there are a lot of people that bring a lot of different perspectives to the table so that you can give them things to experience, and then they will sort of like give you both what it was like to experience that, and then what they were thinking about as they were doing it. And so you can sort of bring all that together and have a really deep and generative conversation. Playdate was also sort of a cheap shot because it was games about dating, sex, and relationships. So it's a topic that like everybody's ready to talk about already. So we got to sort of just bring out this slate of really weird, fascinating games that we're all trying to think about, like, how does sex operate as a goal, as a gameplay mechanic, as a sort of like thing that's always in the background, like what is the function of sex if it's going to be something integral to this sort of art form? And it really, I think, offered people a chance to think a lot about how that operates both in video games and then in other places. And so it became this really great conversation about sort of like what are the potentials of digital art, what's new and what isn't. And I thought that was actually a really sort of, it was great for all those reasons. It was also just like a really broad lineup of, like, I think these events are also at their best when we give people a chance to see things they wouldn't find otherwise. And so it was like a slate of things that, like, even if you're familiar with some of them, you probably haven't, I hadn't seen all of those things until we put them together in a room. And so getting the opportunity to also make surprising connections across different kinds of gaming texts was really cool.
It's such a cool series. I had a chance to go to that one, and we were packed. I think we actually might have run out of computers at that event. We had people crowded around the computers. It was pretty cool. Mm-hmm. So what are your plans with the RPG series going forward? How do you see it evolving?
In our lowest moments, we worry that all we're doing is like video game book club, that like we get a bunch of people together in a room and we get a game, and then we don't really give them enough structure to understand why that's a useful thing to do. So one of the things we really want to do next year moving forward is to try to sort of build in to each event a way of sort of conceptualizing what is the reason for, what is the principal selection behind these things, how did they end up here together, what are we trying to get you to take away from this? Because I think we want them to feel less like self-contained moments where you come, you do this thing that was really great, but then you leave, and it's not quite clear how the connections are supposed to work. And I think part of facilitating that is for us about being much clearer about what are we trying to get out of each of these games, right? What are we trying to get out of this pairing? I think we're also going for some higher stakes things next year. So we have an event about sort of video games and violence. We have an event about video games in the military. A lot of things that have been on our mind, but that we didn't really feel like we were ready to take on yet. Now that we feel a little more comfortable with getting people into the room, will they actually show up? Will the games actually work? Like, now that we feel like that will work, we feel like we can go for some sort of bigger, broader topics.
So last question, if somebody's interested in starting something like the RPG series at their institution, what advice would you give them? What have you learned over the past year that might be useful for someone else to know?
One of the things that I learned early on, kind of in the proto version of the RPG series, is that it's really powerful to just reach out to people who make things that you like. That's not always going to work when you're dealing with large corporate entities, but one of my favorite things about gaming right now is that the independent game scene and the alt game scene are often things that produce really interesting objects just with one or two people. So if you reach out to those people and say, hey, I would really like to start an academic discussion around your game, they'll be super generous and grateful. They'll probably be willing to talk to you about it. So that's really the first step. You know, navigating the university difficulties of finding a computer lab or getting space to have an event, that's a bit more complicated. But I've just been overwhelmed by the generosity and excitement that this has generated among people who make these games.
For the event that I coordinated, we had several developers give us their access to their games for free. And also we had a developer who gave us 3 free codes to give away to our attendees. And we ended up raffling those off and giving those out.
Never underestimate the power of free pizza.
Yes.
Anything if you feed them.
So the power of free pizza and the power of making connections and just asking. Yeah. All right. So are there any last thoughts that you'd like to throw in there before we close this?
I think I'm excited about the fact that the RPG series, as well as a few other things that have happened at the same time, has sort of kind of built up a more formal interest in game studies in our department to a great degree that we're actually building a gaming lab next door. So one of the advantages of taking on events like this and doing something that originally seems really small and really grassroots is that it can build into something a little bit bigger. And feeling like we contributed to that, I think, is one of the best parts of this experience.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk today, guys. If our viewers are interested in hearing more about the RPG series, they can watch for your blog Carnival post, which will be coming out soon. They can also check out the other posts in the Gaming and Social Justice blog Carnival series. If you'd like to talk real time about gaming and how it might fit into your classroom, join us at 7 o'clock this Friday, which is 5/1, for a Twitter chat, #DRC chat. Thank you so much, James, Tiffany, and Andrew. It's been great talking to you.
Thanks.
Take care.